Russia's operation in Ukraine drags on for over 4 months now, and it is still unclear how and when it will end. Before the conflict, many suspected that Ukraine would fall pretty fast. Kremlin's elites were expecting that, and even Western experts speculated that Kiev would have been conquered in 3 or 4 days. In today's video, we will discuss what might have happened if Russia somehow successfully took over Ukraine in a short period of time. The first question we have to ask is, what would Ukraine be after it's taken over by Russian forces? In case of a quick and successful blitzkrieg, the Russian government most likely would have kept the Ukrainian borders as is, but of course excluding Crimea. Then a puppet government would have been established. Plans for splitting Ukraine into regions followed by annexation were supposedly devised during the special operation, when Russian forces could only occupy a part of the territories. So it is possible that a partial annexation would have taken place, with Russian-speaking regions joining Russia. The current Ukrainian government would have been completely abolished, and the higher-ups faced capital punishment. That's exactly what the so-called denazification of Ukraine entails. The Russian government would have replaced all leaders with its puppets. Perhaps famous Ukrainian politicians with pro-Russian positions would have led the country, such as Boyko, Murayev, and Medvedchuk. Another possibility is the creation of a police state, led by Ukrainian generals that switched sides. Basically, a military junta would have been established. The head of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine warned of such Russian plans, and claimed that High Command had some pro-Russian generals among them. Internal policy would have been strict towards any form of opposition. This would have led to mass repressions. Before the attack, Western intelligence reported that the Russian government made a list of pro-Ukrainian activists they were planning to repress. This would also be a part of a so-called denazification. Ukraine would have become a police state under total censorship, with a complete overhaul of the educational system and a countrywide ban on the use of Ukrainian language. Millions of people would have been forced to flee to Europe under threats of persecution and repressions. Europe wouldn't be able to handle that amount of refugees. The country's economy would also fall in the hands of Russian elites, who'd start redistributing the capital. Some businesses would have been controlled by the government, others given to Russian oligarchs. The economy would have completely shifted its focus on Russia and other members of the Eurasian Economic Union. Even after winning, Russian troops would have had to stay on Ukrainian territory to prevent any guerrilla movements from forming. It is possible that an underground rebellion would have been formed that sparked guerrilla warfare in multiple regions. Just like with the Afghan Mujahideen back when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, Ukrainian rebels would have been supported by the West. The mass-supplied handheld anti-tank missiles and grenade launchers were designed specifically for guerrilla warfare. Ukraine's military would have also been completely disbanded, as part of the Kremlin's plan to demilitarize the country. The structure of the Ukraine's armed forces probably would have been extremely limited, like in Germany or Japan after World War II, with just a couple of platoons left and all heavy weapon systems taken away. Ukraine's external policy would have been controlled by Kremlin, forcing the country to join every pro-Russian international organization, like the Eurasian Economic Union and CSTO. The integration would continue on the allied nation basis, with Ukraine joining Russia alongside Belarus. This would have probably triggered the process of assimilation, and Russia would have completely taken over 2 of its closest neighbors. Ukraine would have become Russia's satellite state, just like Belarus today. Western countries would not have accepted this new government. If a part of the Ukraine's ruling class were able to successfully escape, they probably would have established a government in exile. It's worth noting that during the first days of the conflict, Western leaders offered Zelensky to evacuate. In regards to Russia, Putin's successful special operation would have been widely supported by citizens, and his ratings would have grown significantly. This scenario would have guaranteed his re-election for president in the year 2024. A quick victory would have strengthened Putin's regime and the elite's positions, which would have led to more repressions in Russia, with everyone who opposed his special operation being kept from any ruling posts. Russia's external policy would have been strengthened. Most of the post-Soviet countries, except the Baltic states, would have allied with Russia, recognizing it as the only superpower in the region. After being victorious, Russia would have switched to Georgia and Moldova that would have had to surrender or face the fate of Ukraine. It's obvious that smaller countries cannot stand up to Kremlin. After Ukraine's occupation, the Russian army would have reached Transnistria. Russia's position in other parts of the world would have also been more stable. It would have had the opportunity to expand its influence in the Middle East and Africa, where it's been struggling for many years. Western countries would have been shocked by this turn of events. They would still impose sanctions on Russia, but they probably would have been way more lenient if the conflict ended quickly with minimal losses. Nevertheless, economic connections between the West and Russia would have been weakened, and the West still would have tried to isolate Russia from its market. All this would have had the same outcome as today, with tense relations between Russia and the West and Europe's militarization. After a successful operation in Ukraine, Putin might have reopened negotiations with the West, but this time from a position of power. Before the conflict, Russia offered the US to reconsider the Europe safety model, demanded demilitarization of some Eastern European countries, and guarantees that Ukraine would not join NATO. That last demand would have been dropped after taking over Ukraine. Ultimately, NATO would have united against Russia, but we can see it happening right now. An arms race between Russia and the US would have begun, similar to what happened during the Cold War. That confrontation would have had the same signs we saw in the 20th century. In regards to the whole world, successful occupation of Ukraine would have created a nasty precedent for other dictatorships to follow. They would have become bolder and more confident. Perhaps it would have destabilized the situation in the whole world and led to even more wars. It is hard to guess what would China do given the situation, but most likely its government would have pushed on Taiwan even harder. Pulling off the same stunt with Taiwan and bringing it under the Communist China control seems like the most probable scenario. In any case, China's position would have been fiercer if the special operation in Ukraine had been a resounding success. In summary, we can say that Russia's occupation of Ukraine would have led to it becoming a puppet pro-Russian state, strengthening Russia's position in the world and putting the West in a tricky situation, while at the same time uniting it. And it would have proven a grim concept that in the 21st century, even not the most advanced countries could still take territories by force. Thanks to all our sponsors on Patreon, Boosty and YouTube. If you like our videos, please consider supporting us.